was catching up with an old college friend the other night. He's a guy who has really taken all the modern cultural advice to heart. He's incredibly emotionally intelligent, reads all the right articles, and he genuinely believes that the whole strong, silent type thing is a relic of the past.
Okay.
And he was practically beaming as he told me about this breakthrough moment he'd had with his fiancée. He described how he'd finally let his guard down completely, dissolve that stoic wall, as he put it, to weep openly about his deep-seated fears, about his career stability.
So he was doing what he was told to do, be vulnerable.
Exactly. To him, this was the ultimate act of intimacy.
Yeah.
He felt like he was finally being the modern man she had always said she wanted.
Right.
But then the conversation just took this sharp, confusing turn. His face fell, and he pulls out his phone to show me a text she sent him just 48 hours after all this.
Oh, no.
It wasn't a message of reassurance. It wasn't support. It was a breakup text. She cited a sudden, vague loss of spark. Said she felt their dynamic had fundamentally shifted. And get this, that she just didn't feel safe anymore.
Safe. That's the key word.
He just sat there, staring at the screen, totally bewildered. And he whispered, I gave her exactly what she asked for. I was vulnerable. So why did she leave? And that moment of shock, that massive chasm between the social script he followed and the harsh result he got, it just perfectly illustrates this trap. It suggests that while society is loudly demanding men dismantle their defenses, there's this quiet, maybe biological reality that can strictly penalize them for doing so.
Yeah.
That story it's just far more than relationship drama, isn't it? It throws this brutal tension into sharp relief.
It really does.
We have this dominant modern script telling men to express deep emotional vulnerability. But for so many guys, it seems like following that script triggers this immediate, almost instinctive negative reaction.
A withdrawal of trust.
A withdrawal of trust, of support from their partners, or even the wider world. It's a profound contradiction, and it leaves men feeling completely bewildered, caught between what they're told they should be and what the world seems to actually demand.
Right.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're focusing entirely on this trap, this fundamental conflict between the cultural demand for emotional transparency and the evolutionary or systemic penalties for that very transparency.
Our mission for this deep dive is, well, it's pretty comprehensive. We want to go far beyond pop psychology here. We're going to unpack this contradiction using neurobiology, human history, and modern sociology. We really want to understand the adaptive significance of male emotional containment.
Why it's still around.
Why it persists, why it was so essential for millennia, and what happens when modern social expectations fundamentally clashed with ancient wiring and, frankly, systemic social bias.
So it's about charting the journey from a biological necessity for composure to this modern crisis of confusion.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this then. I think we have to start at the most fundamental level, right? Inside the brain. We had to understand the physical infrastructure of emotional control before we can even begin to talk about the cultural consequences.
The first step is definitely looking inward, specifically at the brain's control centers for emotion and threat detection. We're focusing on what's called the cortical-limbic circuit.
The cortical-limbic circuit.
It's the core regulatory system for all our socio-emotional processing.
So when you talk about that circuit, are we essentially talking about the engine of emotion and the brakes that control it? What are the key players?
That's the perfect analogy. The key components are the amygdala, which is nestled deep in the limbic system, and then regions of the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, which is right behind your forehead.
Okay.
Think of the amygdala as the brain's smoke alarm. It's hypersensitive to threat, to uncertainty, to anything salient, especially emotionally charged information, like an angry face or a fearful one. It reacts fast.
And the PFC.
The PFC, particularly the medial and lateral regions, is the fire marshal. It's the primary regulator. Its job is to integrate all the effective valuations it gets from that alarm system.
The amygdala.
Right. And then provide what we call top-down signaling to regulate our behavioral and emotional responses to those stimuli.
So if the amygdala screams fire, the PFC is supposed to step in and say, hang on, let's quiet down and assess the situation rationally.
Right.
Is it really a fire or just burnt toast?
Exactly. That sounds like the neurological basis for stoicism, doesn't it? The containment of a raw emotional reaction.
It does.
And that top-down signaling is absolutely crucial for self-regulation and composure. We know how non-negotiable this PFC regulation is because of, well, clinical evidence from people with brain damage.
Right.
For instance, patients who have lesions in their ventromedial PFC, the VMPFC, they demonstrate this persistent, uncontrolled amygdala reactivity, even when they're just looking at mildly aversive images.
So their alarm system just keeps ringing and ringing.
It keeps ringing because the governor, the PFC, is broken.
Yeah.
This clinical reality shows us that the PFC isn't just a mediator, it is the necessary brake system for emotional response.
And when those brakes are compromised, even without physical damage, I'm guessing we see a pathway to psychiatric risk, especially in environments that demand a high level of emotional endurance.
That's the critical insight. There was a powerful study that focused on young men in high-stress, low-income urban contexts. They looked at the functional connectivity in this very circuit.
How do they do that?
They had the men in a scanner and observed them while they processed threatening or neutral faces. And what they discovered was a very specific predictive marker.
Okay.
Weakened negative connectivity between the amygdala and the PFC, specifically a part called the left middle frontal gyrus, which corresponds to the dorsolateral PFC during moments of fear processing.
Right.
This specific weakness uniquely predicted significant increases in what we call internalizing symptoms, things like anxiety and depression, when they were measured 2 years later.
Okay, we need to slow down on that term. Weakened negative connectivity. What does that actually look like in real terms for you listening?
Okay, imagine you're driving a car down a really steep hill at high speed. The amygdala is the speedometer, and it's hitting the red zone.
Mm-hmm.
Negative connectivity is the braking system. Weakened negative connectivity means that when your emotional speed is high, like when you're processing fear, the PFC is failing to properly downregulate or inhibit that amygdala hyperactivation.
It's a loss of braking power.
It's a total loss of braking power, a failure of containment.
Wow.
Exactly. It's a failure of the brain's ability to put the brakes on fear and threat responses. And this failure of emotional containment, rooted in the integrity of your neural wiring, uniquely predicts psychiatric risk in these young men over time.
So this suggests that the capacity for stoicism, that reliable ability to keep the fear response contained, is fundamentally linked to neurobiological efficiency, especially when you're facing an external threat.
It is, which brings us directly to a key hormonal modulator, testosterone.
Of course. How does the classic male hormone play into this really complex regulatory system?
Well, testosterone, or T, is a steroid hormone, and it acts as a powerful modulator on this whole frontal limbic system. It specifically regulates social emotional behavior, like our tendency to approach or avoid a perceived threat.
Okay.
And the studies on this are fascinating because they don't just measure baseline activity. They look at scenarios that require effortful, voluntary control.
What do you mean by that?
They ask men to perform tasks that require them to override their automatic social tendencies. For example, they might have to force themselves to approach an angry face or avoid a happy one. These are called affect-incongruent trials.
So they're going against their gut instinct.
Precisely. And it turns out testosterone levels dictate how the brain executes this deliberate control.
Okay, so what's the difference in neural strategy between a guy with low T and a guy with high T when they're trying to exert this kind of emotional control?
Well, men with low endogenous testosterone have to rely on a much stronger negative coupling.
Or braking power.
They have to expend greater, more effortful inhibition from the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, the VLPFC, onto the amygdala during those controlled trials.
So they are deliberately using their executive function energy to suppress that automatic emotional response.
Yes. They are choosing to be stoic by sheer force of will.
Which means, for them, achieving that emotional containment is resource intensive. It's probably exhausting.
Absolutely. Now flip that to the pattern we see in males with high testosterone. They rely less on this strong, deliberate frontal inhibition from the VLPFC pathway to override those automatic social emotional responses.
So their brain is managing emotional control in a way that's more efficient, more automated.
That's a great way to put it. It's a more automated composure, requiring fewer executive function resources in the moment.
Wait a minute. If high T men are less reliant on this conscious frontal inhibition, doesn't that imply their composure is more automatic, more reflexive, and less of a conscious controlled expression? I mean, it sounds like we're rewarding neurological automation over conscious effortful choice.
That is the perfect way to frame it. And the implication is huge. It suggests that emotional containment isn't just a cultural norm we learn.
Right.
It may be neurobiologically efficient for men with higher T, reflecting an adaptive mechanism. This kind of automated control would be highly valuable in situations demanding quick, stable decision-making, like, say, situations involving threat or social competition.
So a high T leader or competitor might manage a public failure with what looks like ease, not because he's psychologically stronger, but because his neural architecture is just less reliant on that energy-intensive PFC braking.
That's the idea.
This means that the man in our opening anecdote, the one who needed to actively dissolve his stoic wall to weep about his career stability, he was showing his partner not just emotional intimacy, but potentially signaling a breakdown in the very neurobiological efficiency that's associated with reliable stability and leadership.
Precisely.
He was performing this exhausting act of conscious, vulnerable expression, but it was interpreted as a sign of critical instability.
His emotional display signaled that the control mechanism was failing under threat. His display of high internal distress contradicted this ancient programming that associates reliable male utility with automated composure and control.
That connection between the biological wiring and the capacity for emotional regulation it's incredibly revealing. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. We see this idea of mandated emotional control reflected and enforced throughout human history.
Oh, absolutely.
Often through these extreme cultural tests that seem designed to cement that neurological imperative.
When you look at the historical and anthropological record, the mandate for male stoicism wasn't, a soft suggestion. It was an extreme, often brutal cultural requirement. It was necessary for the effective functioning and, frankly, the survival of the group.
Today, we talk a lot about the modern crisis of manhood, that extended adolescence that stretches well into your 30s and 40s. And a lot of scholars link this crisis directly to the near total disappearance of rites of passage.
The loss of these rights is absolutely crucial because they traditionally provided these clear, irreversible markers of transition.
Right, and community validation.
Yes, community validation of that new status.
Yeah.
And critically, across hundreds of diverse cultures all over the globe, the common denominator in almost all male initiation rituals was the requirement to pass the test of manhood by demonstrating courage, endurance, and, most importantly, the ability to control one's emotions.
And these rituals, they weren't designed to be comfortable self-help seminars, were they? They were tests of agony and psychological endurance that demanded absolute control. But isn't it a bit patronizing to link modern mental health issues to the disappearance of, say, the bullet ant ritual? Aren't there more immediate social stressors we should be looking at?
That's a fair challenge. And the point isn't that modern men need to go out and undergo ritualized torture.
Right.
The point is to understand the adaptive function of the stoicism that those rituals enforced. These rituals calibrated the young male to the specific psychological requirements of their adaptive niche.
Which was what?
Being a reliable protector and a resource provider in high-stakes environments, like warfare or high-risk hunting. Failure to contain your fear or your pain meant group failure. The intensity of the ritual was proportional to the stakes of the group's survival.
Let's detail some of the most intense examples just to emphasize the severity of this mandate for control.
Okay, take the Sadarmao tribe in the Brazilian Amazon. To become a man, a boy has to undergo the bullet ant glove ritual.
I've heard of this. It's insane.
It is. He places his hand into a glove woven with dozens of bullet ants, whose sting is ranked as the most painful insect sting on the Schmidt Sting Pain Index. It's described as waves of throbbing, all-consuming pain that lasts for a full 24 hours.
Unbelievable.
And the boys have to endure this for over 10 minutes without making a single noise or showing any visible distress.
The silence is a test.
The silence is the test. And this ordeal has to be repeated several times over months or even years. The cultural consequence of failure is severe. The boy has not proven himself worthy of being an effective warrior or community member. The silence itself is the measure of success.
Then you look at something like the now defunct but historically powerful Mandan hook hanging ritual.
Among certain Native American tribes, yes. After fasting for 3 days, young men had large wooden splints pierced deep through their chest, shoulder, and back muscles.
Oh my God.
They were winched up, suspended by ropes attached to these splints, bearing their entire body weight, and they must not cry out in pain. The ritual demanded a silent, internalizing endurance. They'd endure hours of this, often having heavy ancestral skulls placed on splints hammered through their arms and legs.
That's of course.
Before the final, agonizing process of having the splints ripped out in the opposite direction.
That level of mandated stoicism enduring agonizing physical pain without a single sound, It fundamentally changes what strength means, doesn't it?
It really does.
It makes a lot of modern social stressors look almost trivial. Yet that ancient requirement for control, that command that the amygdala stay silent, is still wired deep into our biology.
And we see it in other contexts, too. The Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania have the Amiratere, their circumcision ritual. During the procedure, friends and family actively surround the initiate and taunt him.
They taunt him.
They say things like, "If you flinch, we will disown you." The goal isn't just the physical act, it's proving courage. The ability to stand still and silent under extreme physical and psychological duress, which is essential for a warrior and protector in their environment.
So the common denominator in all of this is that the transition to male adulthood was defined by internalizing threat, not expressing it.
Because the utility of the male lay in external performance and group stability.
That's the key phrase right there, external utility.
Exactly. And to understand the adaptive function of this control, we can shift focus to the Semana forager farmers in Bolivia. This is an ostensibly egalitarian society where leadership is diffuse, it's non-hierarchical. Yet a clear political leadership advantage persists for men.
How significant was this political advantage even when, external Western-style governance structures were minimal?
It was very significant. Men scored much higher on various political leadership measures. 67% higher on verbal influence during community gatherings, 64% higher on project coordination.
Wow.
And when community conflict mediation was required, men were nearly 5 times more likely to be named as conflict mediators than women.
So even in a society that's actively striving for equality, this pattern of male leadership and political utility remains dominant. What explains that difference in utility?
Well, the Semini study showed that the men's leadership advantage was tied to specific measurable factors: greater weight and physical strength, more years of formal schooling, and crucially, a greater number of cooperation partners, especially non-kin.
So leadership isn't just about being smart. It's about external social capital, the size of your network, and your physical formidability.
Absolutely. And this stems directly from the sexual division of labor and sexual selection dynamics. Men were historically and evolutionarily favored to participate in labor outside the household.
Hunting, defense.
Hunting, resource defense, long-distance trade, or warfare. All of this necessitated building large, stable, non-kin coalitions. These coalitions were essential for status competition and resource pooling, and the ability to command these large external networks requires predictability, strength, and crucially, emotional composure under pressure.
Meanwhile, the woman's role, dominated by intra-household labor, childcare, and domestic chores, that imposed higher opportunity costs for building these vast external networks.
Correct. The intense demands of childcare meant that women's broader social networking and political influence were often restricted until later in life, sometimes near menopause.
So political leadership, which really depends on strength, education, and social capital, built outside the immediate family unit, historically and evolutionarily favored men.
Exactly. And emotional containment in this context wasn't toxic. It was the psychological prerequisite for maintaining the appearance of stability necessary to lead, defend, and ensure the survival of the group in these high-stakes competitive environments. It was an adaptive trait of immense utility.
Okay, so the anthropological view confirms that male value was historically tied to this external utility, control, and competence. Now, we confront the modern reality where society destabilizes those utility pillars through massive economic and legal shifts, and then, paradoxically, mandates the emotional vulnerability that was once penalized.
This creates a severe trap.
And this brings us right to the silent crisis in men's mental health, where that biological suppression mechanism we talked about seems to be failing, yet the expression of that failure is systemically rejected or just ignored.
The epidemiological data presents a really stark paradox. Men report significantly lower prevalence rates for common mental disorders like anxiety and depression than women do. It's roughly a 1-to-2 ratio. However, men account for 75% of all completed suicides.
That statistical chasm is just impossible to ignore. I mean, if depression is implicated in roughly half of all suicides, then that low diagnosis rate, coupled with the extremely high death rate, it just screams that our traditional methods of screening and diagnosis are fundamentally flawed.
They are flawed. They're flawed because they rely on symptoms that women tend to exhibit, what we call acting in.
Acting in.
These are the traditional internalizing symptoms like suicidal ideation, feelings of worthlessness, low self-esteem. Men, however, are less likely to report these traditional symptoms because they conflict with these deeply entrenched notions of masculinity, stubbornness, stoicism, self-reliance.
So if they aren't acting in, they must be acting out.
Precisely. Men tend to express distress through externalizing behaviors, which researchers now term depressive equivalents.
Okay, like what?
These include high levels of alcohol and substance misuse, dangerous risk-taking, reckless driving, gambling addiction, poor impulse control, and increased anger and irritability that often comes out as, say, destructive aggression or road rage.
So the sadness and the distress are just manifesting as dangerous or antisocial behavior instead of vulnerability. Instead of saying, I feel hopeless and worthless, the man is saying, I need another six-pack and I'm going to drive too fast tonight because nothing matters.
That's a perfect illustration. These externalizing behaviors mask the underlying emotional state. And because standard psychiatric diagnostic criteria largely exclude these acting out behaviors, men are consistently misclassified.
Which leads to low prevalence rates and a ton of male false negatives.
Exactly. This hidden nature is why it is rightly called a silent crisis. It's a crisis hidden not because men don't suffer, but because their suffering looks like criminality or recklessness to the external world, not depression.
We established that work and external contribution have traditionally been the primary pillars of male self-identity and self-worth. So what happens when socioeconomic forces just shatter those pillars?
It creates devastating risk factors. Work is so much more than a paycheck for many men. It is their status and their meaning. Unemployment has a significantly stronger and more acute effect on the mental health of men compared to women.
How much stronger?
In some studies, the mental health impact is nearly twice as severe.
Wow. And the economic shifts of the last few decades have been absolutely brutal to male-dominated fields.
They have. The mass transition of Western economies from manufacturing, heavy industry, and mining to service-based and knowledge economies has fundamentally destabilized male identity. The reliable job for life that provided status and resources has all but vanished,
leaving millions of men, particularly those who are rural and less educated, feeling alienated and without a meaningful place in the new economy.
That's right. And the data confirms this existential loss. The highest male suicide rates are found concentrated precisely within these economically precarious male-dominated industries, construction, farming, factory work, where the loss of utility is most keenly felt.
And this sense of existential threat is then compounded by family disruption.
Yes, divorce and romantic breakup are immensely strong risk factors for mental illness and suicide, and they consistently affect men worse than women. Divorced men are roughly twice as likely to report depressive episodes in the 2 years following a divorce than divorced women.
Why the amplified impact on men, though?
It connects directly to social support networks. Studies show men often rely primarily, sometimes exclusively, on their partner and the nuclear family unit for emotional support and connection. When a divorce happens, that central pillar of support is just gone, and men's external social networks are often insufficient to fill that void. One study indicated that 19% of divorced or separated men reported a dramatic drop in social support compared to only 11% for women.
Which reflects that women typically have larger, more robust social safety nets outside of just their spouse.
Exactly. So the loss of the spouse is also the loss of their primary therapist, their caregiver, their social gatekeeper. The loss is profound, often leading to isolation.
I see.
And we can see this at a macro level. Rising divorce rates in places like Canada have been statistically linked directly to rising male suicide rates, which increased dramatically after the passage of the Divorce Act in 1968. The state-sanctioned dissolution of the family unit is a powerful driver of this existential crisis for men whose identity is rooted in that familial and protective utility.
This leads us to what might be the ultimate institutional penalty for men. The legal system, which, particularly in family court, seems to embody this disposable male hypothesis.
This is the critical and often silent systemic bias. It's known colloquially as the throwaway dads phenomenon. In most Western jurisdictions, the legal standard for custody is the gender-blind best interests of the child. Yet court statistics across decades consistently reveal a severe, non-negotiable gender bias against fathers in custody determinations.
So if the law is gender neutral on paper, what is driving this persistent bias?
The legal process, despite the modern statutory language, is still strongly embedded in tradition and stereotypical attitudes.
The old habits die hard.
Very hard. The historical roots of the tender years doctrine, which asserted that young children belonged with their mother, they persist today. Women are often viewed by judges, by lawyers, by evaluators as the naturally qualified nurturers and custodial parents.
Oh, men are relegated to the role of financial resource and occasional visitor.
The stereotype of man as breadwinner and protector, whose utility is outside the intimate care role, remains powerfully institutionalized.
Let's talk specifics. I know that Michigan stat for 99 was shocking, but is this a systemic multi-decade pattern?
It is a systemic pattern, yes. It's reflected across multiple jurisdictions, even in places with strong joint custody presumptions. Comprehensive data tracking across North America routinely shows that in contested cases, where both parents are deemed fit but they disagree on physical custody, mothers are awarded primary physical custody at rates often 3 to 5 times higher than fathers.
So when utility is questioned in the domestic sphere, the state often defaults to stripping the father of his primary utility, his active role in raising his own children.
And this denial of custody is not just emotional pain. It's a fundamental denial of due process and a profound state-sanctioned blow to the male sense of meaning and purpose.
The formal institutionalization of the disposable male hypothesis.
It is. Fathers, denied custodial rights, are cut off from the very foundation of their familial utility. This leads to feelings of being, and this is a quote from a study, bereft of purpose and meaning. The power of the state is used not just to separate the parents, but frequently to keep the father and children apart.
Which reinforces this devastating societal message that the man's primary value, his protector-provider utility, is disposable upon divorce.
And the economic ramifications are then compounded by the psychological devastation of lost connection and forced irrelevance.
So we've mapped the biological imperative for control, the cultural conditioning for stoicism, and the severe systemic social penalties, economic and legal, that men face when their traditional utility is stripped away. Now, let's bring it all back to that moment where the modern script Be Vulnerable crashes headfirst into that reality, specifically in the context of mental health.
The collision is most evident in the low rates of help seeking. We see that consistent pattern. Men severely underutilize mental health services compared to women. Women are often twice as likely to attend appointments.
And the easy, almost lazy explanation is always that men are just too stubborn and self-reliant, that they see seeking help as a sign of weakness.
Right. And while that personal resistance certainly plays a role, many scholars now argue that focusing solely on male stubbornness is dangerously simplistic. It risks becoming a form of victim blaming. It effectively ignores the massive systemic and cultural barriers that men face when they try to conform to the modern standard of emotional openness. They are often punished, not helped.
What are these structural barriers then? Let's start with how society responds to men's pain.
There's a clear empathy gap. Content analyses of media show that when women discuss mental illness, they are presented more sympathetically and their struggle is validated. Conversely, the media often tends to berate men for being silent about depression and for being reluctant to seek help, rather than offering encouragement or presenting supportive, actionable pathways.
So the message is, you should be talking, but when you do, we might judge or dismiss you.
Exactly. Societal sympathy is often profoundly lacking for men in distress.
And then there's the argument that the mental health system itself is structurally incompatible with the male psychological experience.
That is the structural critique of the inherently feminized system. Services often prioritize very specific therapeutic modalities, talk-based narrative therapy, intense emotional vulnerability, in-depth, undirected self-disclosure.
All things culturally associated with feminine forms of coping and processing.
Precisely. And that creates an immediate incompatibility for men who, due to their conditioning and possibly their neurobiology, prefer concrete action, problem-solving, and utility-driven approaches.
And that barrier is reinforced by the workforce demographics, isn't it?
Absolutely. The mental health workforce is predominantly female. In the U.S., for instance, 82% of social workers and 88% of psychiatric aides are women.
So if you're a man and you walk into a system where nearly everyone involved is a woman, speaking in emotional language you were historically conditioned to avoid.
Seeking help can feel like submitting to a foreign, disempowering, and feminine environment. It just reinforces the fear that seeking help confirms one's weakness.
And even when men do enter the system, they might find their stoicism inadvertently reinforced by the providers themselves.
Yes, research suggests that healthcare providers are not immune to these gender norms. They may inadvertently reinforce stoical masculinity among men by spending less time with them, offering fewer explanations, and being less likely to proactively probe for deep emotional suffering in men compared to women.
So when a man says, "I'm fine, just stressed about work," the provider might just accept that surface answer.
They might. It validates the male instinct to downplay symptoms in the clinical encounter. The system requires men to become articulate in a specific emotional language that they were trained their whole lives not to speak, and that often leads to a dead end.
This synthesis brings us back so powerfully to our opening anecdote. The man who was vulnerable about his career fears and was instantly penalized with a breakup.
That man followed the modern social script perfectly. He was transparent, he shared his deepest fears, he was emotionally open, yet the price was a breakup, citing a loss of spark and a lack of feeling safe. We can now map this outcome across everything we've discussed. His weeping signaled a breakdown in neurobiological control,
That's part one.
breaching the millennia-old requirement for composure and utility.
Part two.
This vulnerability, particularly concerning career stability, threatened his future economic utility.
Part three.
And the response he received was not the expected modern empathy, but an ancient instinctive recoil from perceived instability, leading to personal loss.
Part four. The trap. A strong man, biologically and culturally, is one who can contain threat, whose executive function is reliably governing his alarm system, and whose external utility, his ability to provide stability, is unquestioned.
And when he dissolved that stoic wall, he signaled instability. His emotional display became a signal of internal distress and potential unfitness for a high-stakes partnership. It contradicted the very qualities of stability, strength, and utility that underpin perceived safety.
So the emotional vulnerability became a signal of threat, not intimacy.
It demonstrated that the behavior demanded by modern social norms is the very behavior that evolution and history train society to interpret as a risk, a failure of utility, and a sign of fundamental weakness.
The tension we face, then, is navigating these ancient neural pathways and these deep-seated sociocultural structures that evolved to reward male emotional control and external utility while trying to build a new, more compassionate social contract.
I think the path forward can't simply involve demanding that men ignore their adaptive wiring or their cultural training. It requires recognizing that society currently imposes high systemic penalties in the labor market, in the legal system, and in social relationships when that wiring breaks down or when men attempt to dismantle it. A constructive path has to involve recognizing the reality of male psychological expression, reforming diagnostic and therapeutic models to be more utility-driven and problem-solving focused, and, crucially, providing alternate, stable foundations of recognized social value and safety that don't rely exclusively on suppressing fundamental human emotions. The ultimate test is whether we can make male vulnerability a viable social strategy rather than a penalized risk.